Life has a way of moving forward whether we are ready or not. The years go by, the seasons change, and before we know it, we find ourselves looking back, wondering where the time went. Some of us carry memories of joy and success, but others look back with regret. Regret for wasted years, missed opportunities, and seasons that feel like they were lost forever. Maybe you feel that way today. Maybe you feel like time has slipped through your fingers, like the years behind you were marked by failure, wrong choices, or painful circumstances beyond your control. It's easy to feel defeated when you look back and see a trail of wasted years. Some of you may feel like you've lost time because of sin. Maybe you wandered away from God, made choices that led you down the wrong path, and now you're living with the consequences. Others may feel like time was stolen from you. Perhaps you were hurt, betrayed, or held back by situations you couldn't change. Maybe you look at your life and see years spent in addiction, broken relationships, fear, or doubt, and you wonder, can anything good come from the time I've lost? I want to tell you today that the God we serve is not just the God of the present or the future. He is the God of the past. He is the God who sees every moment, every mistake, every setback, and He is the God who restores. The Bible says in Joel 2:25, I will restore to you the years that the locust has eaten. Think about that for a moment. God is not just saying He will bless you moving forward. He is saying He will restore what was lost. He is saying that He has the power to take the broken, wasted years of your past and redeem them for His glory. We see this throughout Scripture. Think of the story of Joseph. He was a young man with dreams full of promise, yet he was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and thrown into prison. Years of his life were taken from him, years that from the outside seemed wasted. But God was not finished. God was working behind the scenes, and in His perfect timing, He elevated Joseph to a position of power where he not only saw restoration in his own life, but was also able to save his family and an entire nation. Joseph himself said in Genesis 50:20, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. That's what God does. He takes what looks wasted and turns it into something powerful. He takes the years that were lost and restores them in a way that is beyond what we could ever imagine. Maybe you feel like Joseph today, forgotten, betrayed, or stuck in a place you never thought you'd be. But hear me when I say this. God is not finished with your story. The lost years are not beyond His reach. The wasted time is not beyond His power. Maybe you feel like the prodigal son. You had a future, you had everything set before you, but you made some choices that led you away from God. Maybe you spent years chasing after things that only left you empty. And now when you look back, all you see are wasted years, mistakes, and missed opportunities. But the beautiful thing about that story is that when the son finally decided to return home, his father was already waiting for him. He didn't shame him. He didn't reject him. He ran to him and embraced him and restored him as a son. That is the heart of God. He's not looking at you with disappointment. He's waiting with open arms, ready to restore what was lost. Some of you may be thinking, but you don't know what I've been through. You don't know how much time I've lost. Maybe you've been through deep pain. Maybe life hasn't been fair and it feels like too much has been taken from you. But let me tell you something. God does not operate by human limitations. He is not bound by time. What may seem wasted to you is not wasted in His hands. He can restore, redeem, and renew in ways that will leave you in awe. God doesn't just give back what was lost. He multiplies it. Job lost everything, but when God restored him, He didn't just give him back what was taken, He gave him twice as much. That's the kind of restoration our God brings. He doesn't just make things right, He makes them better than they ever were before. So if you're carrying the weight of wasted years today, if you're looking back and feeling like it's too late, I want to remind you that God is still at work. He is not finished with you. The time you feel was lost is not lost to Him. He is the God who restores, and He is able to bring beauty from even the most broken seasons of your life. Now is not the time to give up. Now is not the time to dwell on the past with regret. Now is the time to lift your eyes, to trust in the one who holds time in his hands, and to believe that he will restore your wasted years. Because he will. He is faithful, and what he has promised he will do. There are moments in life when we look around and wonder if things will ever get better. We see the years we've lost, the mistakes we've made, and the opportunities that have slipped through our fingers, and we begin to ask, can anything good come out of this? We live in a world that tells us once something is broken, it's never quite the same. Once time is lost, it's gone forever. Once a door is closed, there's no opening it again. But let me tell you something today. Our God is not like this world. Our God is a God of restoration. When we talk about restoration, we're not just talking about fixing something so it looks good on the outside. We're talking about a deep, complete, miraculous work that only God can do. When God restores, he doesn't just put the broken pieces back together, he makes them stronger. He doesn't just return what was lost, he gives back more than we ever had before. That's the kind of God we serve. We see it all throughout the Bible. God is in the business of taking what was ruined and making it whole again. Think about Job. Job was a man who lost everything, his family, his wealth, his health. If there was ever a man who had a reason to say, my best years are behind me, it was Job. And yet God had other plans. The Bible tells us that when God restored Job, he didn't just give him back what he had before, he blessed him with twice as much. Job 42:10 says, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. That's what God does. He takes what seems ruined, what seems wasted, and he restores it beyond anything we could imagine. Maybe today you feel like Job. Maybe you've lost something. Maybe you've lost years to pain, to regret, to circumstances beyond your control. Maybe you feel like life has passed you by and you don't know if you'll ever get those years back. But I want you to hear this today. God is not finished with you. The story of Job didn't end in his suffering. The story of Job ended in restoration. And the same God who restored Job is the same God who can restore you. Look at the story of Naomi. She left her homeland with her husband and sons, expecting a better life, but instead she lost everything. By the time she returned home, she was bitter and broken, convinced that God had abandoned her. She even told people to stop calling her Naomi and to call her Mara instead, because Mara means bitter. But what she didn't realize was that God was already working on her restoration. Through Ruth, through divine appointments and unexpected blessings, God took Naomi's sorrow and turned it into joy. The same woman who thought her life was over became the grandmother to the lineage of King David and ultimately to Jesus himself. That's what happens when God restores. He takes the ashes and brings beauty. He takes the broken years and turns them into something meaningful, something powerful, something that will bring glory to his name. Maybe you've been carrying regret. Maybe you've been thinking, if only I had done things differently. If only I had made better choices, if only I hadn't wasted all that time. But let me tell you this, God already knows. He sees every moment of your past, and yet he still has a future for you. He doesn't hold your past against you. He doesn't look at your life and say, you're too far gone. No, he says, come to me, trust me, let me restore what was lost. Jesus himself came to restore what was broken. He came to seek and save the lost, to heal the brokenhearted, to give beauty for ashes, and he's still doing it today. He's doing it in the lives of people who turn to him, who put their trust in him, who believe that he is able. So the question is, will you trust him? Will you believe that he can restore your wasted years? Because he can. It doesn't matter how long it's been. It doesn't matter how far you've fallen. It doesn't matter what has been taken from you. God is able to give you back more than you ever lost. I don't know what you've been through. I don't know what regrets you carry, but I do know this. God is still in the business of restoration. He is still bringing hope to the hopeless, healing to the broken, and new life to those who thought their best days were behind them. And if you will trust him, if you will surrender your past to him, he will do the same for you. Because when God restores, He doesn't just make things the way they used to be, He makes them better. There comes a time in every person's life when they have to make a decision about what they will do with their past. Some people spend their whole lives looking back, weighed down by regret, wishing they had made different choices. Others try to ignore their past, pushing it aside, pretending it never happened, hoping it won't catch up with them. But God offers a different way. He offers restoration. And restoration begins when we turn back to Him with a heart that is fully surrendered. It's not always easy to face where we've been. It's not easy to admit that we've made mistakes, that we've gone in the wrong direction, or that we've wasted years chasing after things that didn't satisfy. But if we are willing to come before God with honesty and humility, He is ready to take everything that was lost and turn it into something beautiful. The Bible is full of stories of people who made mistakes, who strayed from God, and yet found redemption when they turned back to Him. Think about the prodigal son. Here was a young man who had everything. His father loved him, provided for him, and had a future prepared for him. But he wanted to do things his own way. So he took his inheritance, left home, and wasted it all on reckless living. He thought he was gaining freedom, but instead he found himself lost, broken, and empty. He had nothing left. He had wasted everything. And when he hit rock bottom, sitting in a pigsty, longing for the scraps that the animals were eating, he finally came to his senses. He said, I will go back to my father. I will tell him I have sinned. Maybe he will take me back as a servant. But what he didn't realize was that his father had been waiting for him all along. The moment he took that first step back home, his father saw him from a distance and ran to him. He didn't scold him. He didn't lecture him. He embraced him. He restored him. And he celebrated his return. That is the heart of God. Some of you today feel like that prodigal son. You've wasted years. You've made choices that took you far from where you should have been. And maybe you're wondering, will God take me back? Will He still have a place for me? Let me tell you something. He is not waiting to condemn you. He is waiting to restore you. He is waiting with open arms, ready to bring you back into His purpose, into His blessings, into His plan for your life. But here's the key. You have to make the decision to return. God won't force you. He won't drag you back against your will. He is calling you. He is drawing you. But you have to take that first step of surrender. You have to be willing to say, Lord, I've tried it my way and it hasn't worked. I give you my life. I give you my past. I give you my future. Do what only you can do. Repentance is not about shame. It's not about dwelling on everything you did wrong. It's about turning around. It's about saying, I don't want to go that way anymore. I want to go God's way. And when you do, He meets you with mercy. He meets you with grace. He meets you with restoration. Look at Peter. Peter was one of Jesus' closest disciples. He walked on water. He saw miracles. He declared that Jesus was the Son of God. But on the night that Jesus was arrested, Peter denied Him. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. He swore he didn't know Him. He turned his back on the very one who had given him purpose. And when the rooster crowed, Peter realized what he had done, and he wept bitterly. Some of you know what that feels like. You know what it's like to realize you've turned your back on God, to feel the weight of your choices. Maybe you've even believed the lie that God can't use you anymore, that you've messed up too much. But look at what happened to Peter. After Jesus rose from the dead, He didn't discard Peter. He didn't say, you failed me, so I'm done with you. No, He restored him. He met him on the shore, and 3 times, one for each denial, Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? And 3 times Peter said, yes, Lord. And Jesus gave him a new purpose, feed my sheep. God's grace is greater than your past. He is not done with you. He is not finished with your story. The enemy wants to keep you trapped in guilt, in regret, in the lie that your best days are behind you. But God says, come back to me. Trust me. Let me restore what was lost. And when you do, something incredible happens. Not only does God forgive, not only does He restore, but He takes everything you went through, every mistake, every failure, every wasted year, and He uses it for His glory. He takes what the enemy meant for evil and He turns it for good. So don't wait another moment. Don't stay in the past. Don't let regret keep you from the future God has for you. Come back to Him. Surrender it all. And watch as He restores what was lost in ways you never imagined. Because He will. And when He does, you'll see that the years you thought were wasted were never wasted at all. They were just part of the testimony He was writing in your life. When God restores, He never just brings back what was lost. He brings back more. That's the nature of His restoration. He doesn't do things halfway. He doesn't simply patch up broken pieces and leave you to figure out the rest. No, when God restores, He multiplies. He makes things better than they were before. He takes what was broken and transforms it into something greater than we ever imagined. Some of you have been looking at your past thinking, if only I could get back what I lost, if only I could undo the mistakes, if only I could go back to how things used to be. But God doesn't just want to take you back. He wants to take you forward. He wants to give you something greater than what you had before. Because when He restores, He brings increase, He brings abundance, He brings purpose. Think about Job. Job lost everything. His family, his wealth, his health. In a single moment, everything was stripped away. And yet in the end, the Bible says that God restored to Job twice as much as he had before. Twice as much. That's the kind of restoration God brings. He didn't just give Job back what was taken. He blessed him beyond what he could have imagined. And Job's story wasn't just about material things. His faith, his understanding of God, his purpose, they were all deepened through what he had been through. He came out of that season not just restored, but transformed. Maybe you've been through something that has left you feeling empty, feeling like the best parts of your life have already passed. Maybe you've been saying, God, just bring me back to where I used to be. But I want to tell you today, God doesn't want to bring you back. He wants to take you higher. He wants to give you more than what you lost. He wants to use your story, your pain, your past, and turn it into something that will glorify Him in ways you never expected. Look at Joseph. He was a young man with dreams, a vision for his future. But before those dreams ever became reality, he was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused and locked away in prison. Years of his life were stolen from him. If anyone had a reason to feel like his best years were wasted, it was Joseph. But God wasn't finished. One day, in a single moment, Joseph went from the prison to the palace. The years of pain, the years of waiting, the years of wondering if things would ever change, God restored them in a way that Joseph never could have planned. And not only did God restore Joseph's life, but He used him to save an entire nation. Joseph himself said to his brothers, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." That's what happens when God restores. He doesn't just bring things back. He turns them around for a greater purpose. He takes the things that were meant to break you and uses them to bless you. He takes the years that felt wasted and turns them into a testimony of His faithfulness. He doesn't just give back, He gives back more. Some of you are in a season of waiting, wondering if God will ever restore what was lost. Maybe you've lost time. Maybe you've lost opportunities. Maybe you've lost relationships, dreams, or hope for the future. But let me remind you today, when God restores, He restores abundantly. He does more than you can ask or imagine. Maybe you've been through a broken season and you feel like the pieces will never fit back together. Maybe you feel like the damage is too great, that there's no way for things to be right again. But I want you to hear this. God doesn't just fix what's broken. He makes all things new. He brings beauty from ashes. He turns mourning into joy. He replaces despair with hope. Think about Ruth. She lost her husband. She left behind everything she had known. By all accounts, her future should have been over. But because she trusted God, because she stayed faithful, God didn't just restore what she lost, He gave her more. He led her to Boaz. He placed her in the lineage of Jesus. And her story became one of redemption that we still talk about today. That's the kind of restoration God brings. It's not just about getting back what was lost. It's about stepping into something greater than you ever imagined. And the best part, it's not dependent on you. It's not about how much you deserve it. It's not about whether you've earned it. It's about God's grace. It's about His faithfulness. It's about His ability to take even the most broken, wasted seasons and turn them into something that brings Him glory. So don't look back with regret. Don't waste time wishing for what used to be. Look forward with expectation, because when God restores, He doesn't just bring things back, He makes them better. He makes them new, and He's ready to do the same for you. One of the greatest lies the enemy whispers into our hearts is that it's too late, that we've lost too much, that we've made too many mistakes, that the years we've wasted can never be restored. And if we're not careful, we start to believe it. We start to settle into the idea that our best days are behind us, that we just have to make peace with what we lost. But that's not what God says. That's not how God works. God doesn't look at you and see wasted time. He doesn't see lost potential. He sees what He always planned for you, what He created you for. And no matter how many years have passed, no matter what you've been through, no matter how far you think you've drifted, God's plan for your life is still in motion. His promises haven't expired. His purpose for you hasn't changed. And if you're still breathing, then He's still working. Think about Moses. Moses was a man who knew he had a calling. He knew that God had placed something inside of him, that he was meant to be a deliverer. But in a moment of anger, he made a mistake. He killed an Egyptian, and when Pharaoh found out, Moses ran for his life. He spent the next 40 years in the wilderness, tending sheep, living in obscurity, far from the life he once thought he would have. 40 years. Some of you think you've wasted a decade or two, but Moses had 4 decades in the wilderness. By the time God appeared to him in the burning bush, Moses had probably given up on the idea that he could ever be used by God. He even argued with God, saying, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" In other words, God, you've got the wrong person. That part of my life is over. But God didn't see Moses as a man who had wasted years. He saw a man He had been preparing. And in one moment, God restored Moses' calling. He took those years in the wilderness, years that seemed empty and forgotten, and used them to shape Moses into the leader who would stand before Pharaoh, who would part the Red Sea, who would lead an entire nation to freedom. That's what God does. He takes what looks like wasted time and uses it for His glory. He takes what we think is broken beyond repair and makes it part of His perfect plan. Maybe you feel like Moses today. Maybe you feel like you've been in the wilderness for too long. Maybe you think the dreams you once had are gone. But listen, God hasn't forgotten you. He hasn't changed His mind about you, and He is more than able to restore everything you thought was lost. Look at Sarah. God promised her a child, but the years went by and nothing happened. She waited and waited and waited, and eventually she gave up. She thought she was too old. She thought the promise had passed her by. She even laughed when God told her she would still have a son. But what did God do? He fulfilled His promise. He gave her Isaac. Because when God makes a promise, He keeps it, no matter how much time has passed. Some of you have been waiting on something for a long time. Maybe you're wondering if it will ever happen. Maybe you've started to lose hope. But I want to remind you today, God is never late. He hasn't forgotten what He spoke over your life. And just because you don't see it yet doesn't mean He's not working. The enemy wants you to believe that it's too late, that you've missed your chance, that you might as well give up. But God says, I will restore the years that the locusts have eaten. He says, I am making all things new. He says, what I have spoken, I will bring to pass. Maybe you've been through a season of loss. Maybe life has not turned out the way you thought it would. Maybe you've made mistakes and you wonder if you've messed up God's plan. But let me tell you, God is not limited by your past. He's not limited by your mistake. He's not limited by time. He can take everything that was lost and bring back something greater than you ever imagined. But here's the key. You have to trust Him. You have to believe that His plan is still in motion. You have to stop looking back in regret and start looking forward in faith, because God is not finished with you. And when He restores completely. So don't believe the lie that it's too late. Don't let the enemy convince you that your best days are behind you. Your story is not over. Your purpose is still alive. And when God restores your wasted years, He will do it in a way that will leave no doubt that His hand was on your life all along. When God restores, He doesn't just do it for you. He does it for His glory. He takes what was broken, what was lost, what was wasted, and he turns it into a testimony that points back to him. Because when God moves in your life, when he brings restoration, it's never just about you. It's about revealing his power, his faithfulness, his love, so that others can see and believe. Some of you have been through things that you never thought you'd survive. You've walked through storms that should have taken you out. You've faced loss, disappointment, and pain so deep you wondered if you'd ever be whole again. But here you are. You may still have scars, but you're standing. And if God has brought you through, if he is in the process of restoring your wasted years, then you need to know your story is not just for you. The enemy wants you to keep silent. He wants you to be ashamed of your past. He wants you to believe that no one would understand, that no one needs to hear what you've been through. But that's a lie, because there is someone out there who needs exactly what you have to share. There is someone who needs to know that restoration is possible. There is someone who needs to hear that God is still in the business of redeeming lives. Think about the woman at the well. She had a past. She had made mistakes. She had been through things that left her broken and ashamed. But then she had an encounter with Jesus, and in that one moment, everything changed. He spoke to her in a way no one else ever had. He didn't condemn her. He restored her. And do you know what she did next? She didn't keep it to herself. She ran back to her town and said, "Come see a man who told me everything I ever did." And because of her testimony, many in that town believed in Jesus. She could have stayed silent. She could have let shame keep her from speaking. But instead, she let God use her story. And because she did, lives were changed. Your story has power. Your testimony has purpose. What God has restored in your life is not just for you. It's for the people he's calling you to reach. Look at Paul. Before he was an apostle, before he preached the gospel to the nations, before he wrote letters that would become part of the Bible, Paul was a man who persecuted Christians. He was a man who thought he was doing the right thing by trying to destroy the church. And yet God didn't look at Paul and see wasted years. He didn't say, "You've done too much wrong, I can't use you." No. God saw who Paul could become, and when he restored him, he turned him into one of the greatest voices for the gospel the world has ever known. Paul didn't hide his past. He didn't pretend that he had never made mistakes. He used his story to point people to Jesus. He said, "I was the worst of sinners, but God showed me mercy so that in me, the worst of sinners, Christ might display his unlimited patience as an example for those who would believe in him." That's what God does. He takes the broken places, the wasted years, and he turns them into a testimony of his grace. He takes what the enemy meant for evil and uses it for good. So what about you? What has God brought you through? What has he restored in your life? Maybe you've seen his hand at work, but you've been afraid to share it. Maybe you've thought, my story isn't big enough. It's not dramatic enough. It's not powerful enough. But let me tell you something. If God has done something in your life, that alone makes it worth sharing. Maybe you're still in the middle of your restoration. Maybe you're still waiting for the breakthrough. That's okay. Because even in the waiting, God is working. Even in the process, he is shaping you, preparing you, strengthening your faith. And when the time comes, he will use your story in ways you never expected, because there is someone out there who needs to hear what you've been through. There is someone who needs to know that they are not alone. There is someone who needs to hear that no matter how many years they think they've wasted, God can still restore them. When he does, don't keep it to yourself. Tell your story. Let your life be a testimony. Let your restoration be a light that points people to Jesus. Because when God restores, he doesn't just change your life, he changes the lives of everyone around you. And he is ready to use you for his glory.